for joining us for today's first programme. We've got Researching TV Histories. We've got some really interesting papers today. We've got one, Researching Starsky and Hutch with Charlotte Stevens, which is what's going to kick us off. We've then got Derek Johnson, who's going to be reading Past Reception. He's done a case study of the BBC's 1984. And we're going to finish off with Ipsita Sahu, who's going to be talking about women in early Indian television and the feminist movement in the 1970s. Just letting some people in. We will be doing the papers one after the other, and we'll be having time for questions after that. We do ask that you stay muted while people are doing their talks. And if there's anything you want to pop into the chat, Matthew, the admin support, will be here to kind of correlate and go through those as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Charlotte Stevens, who's going to be talking about Starsky and Hutch. What a wonderful way to start a Monday. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you very much. It's mostly Starsky and Hutch, but some other shows do crawl in there. So yeah, hello, thank you very much for joining us. It's my first time at CST, and I'm really excited to be part of this panel. This presentation shares some material from post-PhD archival work that I did in 2018 and 2019, and some of which I have written up, but I am hoping to build on it in the near future. So I plan to be talking about letterzines and how they work as an object of study, what we can find in letterzines that's of interest to us as folks who are interested in television histories, such as like discussions of characterization and plot from audiences and fans, negotiations of meanings in new episodes as they were airing in the 70s and 80s, and discussions of how fans watched television in their own homes with friends and at fan conventions. And also to bring in a bit of a case study around the affordances of videotape and binge watching as videotape became a new technology. And to finish off with some reflection about working with discussions about television that aren't prompted by researchers' questions, don't address an authority, and aren't like live tweeting or message boards or other kind of digital performances. So, what are letterzines? How do they work as an object of study? Letterzines are a kind of fanzine that are explicitly designed to disseminate letters of comment in which fans discuss their television viewing. They grow out of Science Fiction Amateur Press Association, or APA, sometimes called APA, tradition of APAzines. An average APAzine will contain articles, news items, bits of fiction, poetry, and a section for letters of comment or blogs. Now, in contrast, a letterzine is going to be almost entirely letters of comment. They're reader contributions that address individuals or the broader readership for the zine, replying to specific points from previous issues, responding to prompts from the zine editors, and otherwise participating in an ongoing conversation with fellow fans. And I focused on media fandom letterzines for this bit of work, which tended to be reflections on fan practice written by women active in what became known as media fandom in the 60s and 70s, so named to signal their difference from male and misogynist fans of literary science fiction who looked down on those who embraced Star Trek and other television sci-fi. And my sample was mostly from the late 70s and early 80s. In this research, I consulted 2 archives amongst the respectable number of science fiction collections and archives around the world. And there's a great roundup list in volume 37, issue 2 of Science Fiction Studies of the global scope of these possible archives, or these archives which are possible to consult. The first was the Merrill Collection of Science Fiction, Speculation, and Fantasy, which is a special collection of the Toronto Public Library, and it's not digitized at all. Their fanzine holdings are indexed in 2 card catalog drawers, which is what I've got on my slide here. And they're mostly general APAzines, but they also include some media fandom letterzines. SNH letterzine and Universal Translator were particularly important for the work, but I've also included that new fandoms there, which is from the 1930s, which is really cool that it exists in this archive. I made 2 trips to Toronto to work through this material in person. And the second archive I consulted was the Cushing Memorial Library and Archives at Texas A&M, which there's two collections, the Media Fanzine Collection and the Sandy Harold Memorial Digitized Fanzines Collection, which hold a significant number of media fanzines, mainly fan fiction, but also some letter zines. And the Cushing staff were really great about providing access to the digitized zines and scanning parts of the collection that weren't yet available in that format. So far I've read through letter zines dedicated to Star Trek, Starsky and Hutch, Simon and Simon, Beauty and the Beast, Robin of Sherwood as well, and also Star Wars, which is really cool to watch, fan reactions and commentary in the late 70s for what was already a Juggernaut property. These letter zines contain, again, interpretations of character, narrative, reports on fan conventions and meetups, and really excitingly, discussions of how women related to contemporary television at a time when VCRs started to saturate the domestic market. Letter zines haven't really been used as a source for historical work, though there is some material from Cindy Gilliland, I think I've got the name correct, published in 1998-1999, as well as the Fandom Studies standard Henry Jenkins, his book from 1992. They use letter zines as accounts of contemporary practice, and I think it's time for us, television scholars, to give letter zines another look. So what can we find in letter zines that's of interest to us as television historians? As I said at the top, we've got stuff about discussions of characterization and plot, creating resources for fellow fans, potentially to guide writing fan fiction. The title of the presentation quotes a 1982 letter in a Starsky and Hutch letter zine, in which watching all 87 episodes in a weekend is described as exquisite torture, but also as a hell of a lot of fun. The letter's an extensively footnoted list of facts about Hutch, compiled mostly through close reading of the episodes. Beyond the familiar to us television scholars experience of screening for textual analysis being both fun and agony, it's notable that the letter writer names this activity as researching rather than watching, jokingly implying a scholarly rigor underpinning this dissemination activity. The footnotes across this letter, which is over 5 pages long, references episode titles and dialogue, as well as an unproduced script for the series of the sort that would have been auctioned off at a fan convention. One footnote also references a single-page biography of Hutch from an earlier issue, contributed by another fan. And this concordance expands and annotates that previous contribution. Now, just as a note, in all the screenshots I've blocked out the names. Fans were writing under their wallet names and provided full mailing addresses, so I'm preserving some anonymity here. We can also find negotiation of meanings in new episodes as they air. This is something I expected to see, and I actually found this most strongly in the Details at 11 letter zine, which was focused on Simon and Simon. The issues I reviewed from that publication were published as the series aired and are full of some fascinating work done by the letter writers as they move through what different aspects of character backstory mean for the characters, how they relate personal experiences to their interpretations, stuff like knowing other Vietnam veterans in their personal life, which helps them understand character work, how siblings may have different relationships with their father, and in some instances trying to reconcile the fans' understanding of the Simon and Simon's father, and as a great man who must have been really cool to raise these wonderful boys, the main characters of the show, with a bit of dialogue that comes in later on in the series about how he had enacted corporal punishment on the younger son, but the older didn't know, or perhaps it was the other way around. But trying to integrate these little elements through conversation and letters and back and forth. Really interesting. And these conversations play out across many issues. And it's typical with lots of letters of comment that each letter writer may address specific past letter writers by name to respond to the particular points. And as an experience as a researcher, it's really lovely to track the back and forth through the subsequent issues. For example, a reply to the Exquisite Torture letter asks how they managed to fit so many episodes in before answering, oh yeah, it was a holiday long weekend, so that's how you could do 87 in a weekend. And in between the text-based discussions of plot and character, there's just a wealth of mundane but fascinating discussions about buying or renting a VCR, how that changed viewers' relationship with television and the fan community. One fan, in 2 letters a few years apart, first notes her excitement in getting a VCR, and then by the mid-'80s is admitting she doesn't have the time to rewatch as much as she'd like, and is begging folks to come and visit her so she has an excuse to pull out her tapes again. And comments also show the level of awareness fans and viewers have about aspects of industry. One Star Trek letterzine has a great account of being a Nielsen family, complete with reflections on potential flaws in sampling, since for their family, it wasn't a typical week when they were chosen to fill out the viewing diaries. And the other, still on this slide here, is another great concordance of, again, this strength of will and single-minded dedication for accurate research. These 5 women are going to get together, drink a bunch of champagne, and find out all the times Starsky and Hutch are barefoot across the whole series. Just lovely, fun, effectively positive kinds of research experience there for me. So the letterzines also contain convention reports that commemorate small fan-run conventions that focus on watching lots of TV as a group. One report from a UK-based fan written about a Starsky and Hutch convention held in Wales, which is here on the slide, seems to signal to that zine's primarily American readership that the British fans were watching key episodes and enjoying them in an appropriate manner. The report here names specific Starsky and Hutch episodes screened over the weekend between blooper reels and interviews. At the very top, there's also a fun reference in the letter to the train being delayed from Darkest Meadowsboro, which is, again, relatable. So yeah, showing blooper reels, interviews, other paraphernalia, charity auctions. The letter writer notes that the screenings were curtailed on the Friday evening by mutual agreement after screening the 3rd season episode Murder Ward, since, quote, all 39 of us were glazed around the eyes, either from the Starsky and bondage scene or from sheer exhaustion. So again, signaling that they're watching in an appropriate manner, definitely noting the bondage part. The weekend's programming also included one episode, The Fix, which, according to the report, had an electrifying effect on the audience. It was actually new to the majority of attendees at this convention. This particular episode had been banned by the BBC and wasn't shown in the UK until 1999. So for these fans in 1982, the convention offered a chance to watch something they'd only read about. The convention appears to have been motivated in part by a desire to consume as many hours of video on good quality copy as possible, all the better to participate in the interpretive community arising through discussion of the episodes. So again, as a potential historical resource, this is such a lovely and rich view into not just how a bunch of fans were engaging with the show soon after it was airing, while it was still an active fan community in that time. Yeah, so it's cool, it's interesting. I very much like it. So, what else to say about this? There's a real striking contrast between the language used in describing watching many episodes of television alone or in a group, such as at this fan convention. Alone, across the letters, there's a tendency towards more negative framings with language of addiction or overdose and desperation frequently used. However, when watching with others, this activity is much more positive or even boastful. And I've definitely noticed that particularly the American fans of Starsky and Hutch and Simon both enjoyed champagne-fueled marathons with friends. That comes up in letters from both fandoms. And one final thing to say here. Bit of a case study now around the affordance of videotape and binge watching. And I am indebted to Mark Jenner's binge watching project here that gave me the opportunity to an excuse to go deeper into this work. So it's just really lovely to find such definitive evidence of marathon viewing or binge watching in 1979. Two on the slide here, two excerpts from the slide here, that offer this precedent of fan-directed watching away from a broadcast schedule on videotape before box sets or Netflix changed everything for the mainstream. And also, it's interesting how the videotape remains implicit in these descriptions, sort of understood, of course, we're doing this with our tape collections. In the first case, again, this is a Starsky and Hutch random example. We've got a memorialization, a poem detailing a particular convention's history with the line, "The video room, it ran all night, we watched with bleary eyes." It's not clear specifically what they watched, since presumably the readers were there or would have had a fair idea of the kind of thing they'd watch. But it's notable and interesting that this is something, again, happening in 1979, where they are watching TV all night. And I highly doubt that any, I think it was in Chicago, local TV station was running an all-night Starsky and Hutch marathon. So it must have been fan directed. And also, from the same year, there's a mention of a fan's regular 8,000-calorie video parties, so named for the abundance of good food on offer, wherein you watch Star Trek episodes for 6 hours or until your eyes quit. And I do want to note the twinned excesses of television and food, both consumed in abundance in this example. However, in contrast to a binge, this description evokes satisfaction or satiation rather than shame or guilt at overdoing either kinds of consumption. Indeed, the language shifts between compliments and self-aware teasing, with the letter writer lauding her host's beautiful home and the delight of meeting other normal people in Star Trek fandom who will be willing to watch Star Trek with you for 6 hours, which, again, relatable, right? And once I started looking for other instances of these kinds of marathons, I was excited to see one letter from 1985 that uses the word binge to refer to compressed engagement with media. This is the only such instance within my sample, though. And rather than watching television, the context of the comment concerns the effort needed to complete a fan awards ballot, with the letter writer rereading many fanzines to make her choice. And the comment is, yes, binge could describe what followed, or constructive indulgence. The phrase constructive indulgence, much like exquisite torture, rather wonderfully exposes some of the tensions around time and labor and shame with regard to leisure in media fandom. In this instance, the pleasure of rereading back issues is framed as an indulgence, and by implication an unnecessary activity, presumably because the zines have already been read once, and there are better uses of this fan's time than revisiting older fan works. Doing the work of reading to fill out the ballot, again, presumably might be otherwise directed towards more useful activity. Reading new zines, writing a letter of comment for inclusion in a future zine, or even spending time doing something not related to watching television. Wild, right? Now, the modifier constructive is fascinating, since this active participation in a fan community, a pleasurable leisure activity, appears to be excused because it's made to have some value. The letter writer is, in a sense, indulging in the practice of fanish good citizenship. The use of binge here elides the work that goes into making a fandom happen. Now, the leisure time of fandom is underpinned by a considerable amount of fanish labor. Letters of comment will regularly make references to canon details, dialogue, costuming, narrative points, which have been fact-checked through rewatching episodes in videotape, occasionally in a marathon, such as with the barefoot concordance on the previous slide. The very detailed letters of comment enact the labor of fandom, as they are based on repeat viewings of the text to verify elements of canon and to report these discoveries back to the community of zine readers. And I should note that Charlotte Bernstein and Lynn Spiegel noted the particular quality of fanish textual analysis enabled by videotape in the introduction to their feminist television criticism reader, albeit in this case it was in reference to making slash vids rather than these kinds of detailed written inputs. Now, these letter writers' performances of verification of facts and details signal their competence and the time available to perform this labor, but also provide a record and reference point for other fans who offer their own analyses and reflections on elements of the series, but may not have time to rewatch on their own. These also appear to be valuable for fan fiction writers who want to verify their characterizations and background details stay within the parameters of canon. These activities are an indulgence, and that immersing oneself in a fanish activity takes away from other tasks that one might be doing, but constructive, and that they contribute to community that only exists through productions of commentaries and paratexts, disseminated through letter zines, and through participation in activities such as the awards. It's generating content. These productive marathons are excused by the letter writers throughout my sample as being for the benefit of community, where the language used enacts the ambivalence around the shame and pleasure of contributing fanish labor to a fandom. And to finish off then, some reflection on working with these discussions about television. This work is really the result of having a free day back in 2018 and then just sort of chasing my curiosity. In intellectual terms, my purpose is to encounter a sample television audience and recount how they accounted for their television watching at a moment of change in the industry with videotape coming along. I've focused on letter zines between 1975 and the early 90s, looking particularly for discussions of videotape. However, the celebrations of buying or renting one's first VCR is more often than not rhetorical punctuation in wider discussions of what the letter writer has been watching, how they've been watching, and how they feel about it. This mix of interpretive, emotive, and more mundane content means I'm thinking about letter zines as capturing conversations about television. Letter zines give access to a particular moment in the histories of women's productive fandom. It also presents a compelling mix of fans' analysis of programs, discussing fan works, and just the practice of watching television. Media fandom letter zines offer something different to a researcher than BBC reader reports or letters to a broadcaster or commercial publication, or responses to ethnographer's question. In form and content, they're organic, backstage accounts of television viewing performed for friends. As archival records, letter zines can potentially nuance our assumptions about what women watched in the past, their views on the programs and the contexts in which they watched television, fundamentally. This is about what motivates the audience's reflections and inputs. Academic research is governed by asking what the researcher wants to know, through approaches such as oral history. Though approaches such as oral history have been used to amplify underrepresented voices. In the case of the letters, these are conversations motivated by and addressed to members of the community. In cases where a new correspondent makes themselves known, they're joining a conversation in progress after they picked up all the back issues that Icon had read through them all. And I really don't mean to frame letter zines as offering us as a pure account of past activity, but merely a different set of accounts addressed to a different readership with different agendas than what we have been using before. Based on reading through a few hundred letter zines, I think there's a great opportunity for us as television scholars to adopt letter zines as a complementary resource in our work. And on the slide, there's a picture of one of my trolleys of the work of the mural collection. So, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Charlotte. That was absolutely fascinating. As I put in the notes, constructive indulgence is my new favourite saying. That was wonderful. And also, I so want to now have my own version of ZebraCon. Thank you so much for that. As I say, there's an opportunity for questions and observations at the end, but just if everyone can just give Charlotte a bit of a clap, put up a little clapping emoji. Thank you for kicking off today with such a brilliant talk. Yeah, applause. Thanks, Claire. People are putting applause in the messages, which is always nice. So that was wonderful. Okay, we're keeping the pace going. We're now switching to Derek Johnson. So Derek, if you'd like, hi Derek, who's going to be talking about reading past reception and a case study that he's done at the BBC on the TV programme 1984. So without further ado, I shall put myself on mute and sit back for what looks to be a fascinating paper.
Thank you, Perry, and thank you, Charlotte, as I try to gauge my right distance from the microphone. This fits in quite nicely, I think, after the previous paper, but I'm going from collections of letters in letter zines to a specific letter, and in fact, a little bit of it. Because years ago, whilst researching in the BBC Written Archive Centre at Caversham, I was going through the files relating to the 1954 adaptation of Orwell's 1984. In particular, one of the files of correspondence. The production had received a large public response, with Lee noting in a later article that the BBC received a record 2,375 letters relating to the production, of which 1,586 were protests, while 789 were appreciations, many received in response to the critical comments in the news. So this suggests that much of the correspondence directed towards the programme was in response not to the programme itself, but rather to the newspaper coverage of the programme. And you can see some of the headlines there, hopefully, from the BBC's press clippings archive. Much of this coverage was intended to stir up discontent by playing on issues of taste and culture, engaging in the sort of behaviour that newspapers do engage in order to gain and retain readers. We'll come to some of the wider causes of this through this paper. But amongst the letters in the BBC archives was one from D. Hunt, which I've transcribed for you here. It particularly caught my attention because of the phrase sadists and readers of horror comics. Great phrase. And this paper takes as its focus the development of my research that span out from that phrase and that discovery, using it as a way to think about how we interpret historical reception. So while I doubt that anything I say will be new, I hope that some of you will find, as I did, some use in pausing to think about these processes of historical interpretation and how we develop our understanding of historical material using, as Charlotte was saying, this correspondence as historical material. And so in that interpretation, how we narrate the history of television and its audiences. So let's start with that note. There are things that could be read from its material form, particularly when taken as part of the wider mass of correspondence, which speak to a culture where letter writing is common, but where care is taken over waste. But that's an aspect I've not really explored properly and which would require further research. So let's keep the focus on the content and on how it's expressed. As I said before, the main phrase I'll look at is readers of horror comics, which is an area that some of you may already have some knowledge about. You may also have noted the phrase horror comic used in relation to 1984 in one of the headlines with which I illustrated the slide with the quotation from Lee. It's a striking phrase because it seems unusual as a point of comparison for an adaptation of a literary novel, albeit one that can also be read as science fiction. Yet there's nothing comic, really, about 1984, and it is certainly not something for children, who are frequently still considered to be the main target audience for comics, and who certainly were the main target audience in the UK in the 1950s. Yet unravelling some of those assumptions will be important here. And that's the key first point that I learned in the first key point that I learned in this research. When an assumption makes something seem weird, challenge the assumption. Martin Barker has covered in very useful detail the campaign against horror comics in Britain in the 1950s. The campaign was largely driven by activists associated with British communism, who drew on concerns around childhood and children's media and connected them to wider concerns about British identity. As Barker notes, by 1954, the term horror comic was being deployed to indicate something that is beneath contempt and the ordinary, average, decent British person won't touch it, knowing instinctively that it is no good for them. Horror comic had become the emblem which could be conjured at will, a label which groups could try to attach to things about which there could be no argument. In other words, the term had largely become detached from specifics of the comics themselves and detached from the specifics of the debates around them, such as the Kefauver hearings in the US or the parliamentary debates in the UK about the importation of horror comics. But what was it about horror comics, in either the specifics or the general use of the term, that made them a relevant comparison to 1984? There is the matter of the horror comics being imported from the US, and so bringing US culture and values to the UK. But that hardly relates to this British novel and its adaptation for the British Broadcasting Corporation. We can see in Barker's summary some relevant attitudes about decency, and particularly appealing to the ordinary and average. This seems particularly relevant when we look back at Hunt's letter and note some of the other expressions of taste here, such as, for weeks on Sundays we have to watch dismal, criminal and sadistically highbrow or are they plays, and thank God for Wilfred Pickles and the Grove family. But to return to this paper's focus on the process of interpreting this letter, we once again have to unpick those references in order to properly understand what might be being communicated here in more specific terms than general anger. The reference to the sadistically highbrow can certainly be seen as positioning the letter's writer as ordinary and average and decent. They are not highbrow, not intellectual. The idea that plays that have been shown on Sundays may have been sadistically highbrow suggests that presenting highbrow content is in itself an act of torturing the audience, causing them unnecessary suffering for the dark pleasures of the programmers. This suggests a feeling of class tension in relation to the sorts of drama offered up by BBC television at this point in the 1950s. But it's a tension that can be seen repeatedly throughout the history of the broadcaster. The point is made more interesting by Hunt's parenthetical comment, or are they, which suggests that the plays may only appear to be highbrow, appear to require education to appreciate, when in fact they are no such thing. This may be a way of resolving the apparent tension in Hunt's letter between describing the production as a horror comic, suggesting something lacking in value intended for the young and uneducated, while also calling it sadistically highbrow, suggesting that this is nothing more than a simplistic horror story, dressed up to appear significant and having intellectual weight, when it's not significant and not intellectual. The sadism may be at least partly in presenting material in a manner which it does not require, of making it more difficult than it needs to be, and in not considering an audience that might engage with any ideas that it might contain if it were presented differently. So the sadism, in other words, is in demonstrating power via cultural and educational capital. Considering that television ownership in the UK boomed in the 1950s, particularly up to and following the coronation in 1953, the year before this particular programme, 1984, and television was becoming an affordable status symbol for many, this tension between presentation, content and audience can be seen as part of the tension of the BBC television service, working out how to relate to this expanding audience from a range of class, educational and regional backgrounds. Where a modern reader may find a disconnect is in this idea of Sunday night dramas as highbrow, when they are more often these days accused of being cosy and nostalgic. This is despite their actual content, as these labels are often applied to productions such as Call the Midwife. There's a long history to this. Joe Moran has pointed out that the Sunday night period drama from the Forsyte saga to Downton Abbey, which the historian Simon Charmer would later accuse of servicing the instincts of cultural necrophilia, came to acquire that same sense of valediction, a raking over of the dying embers of the weekend as evensong. Sunday evening, as a Sabbatarian hangover from church going and pub opening hours, was the night when people were most likely to stay in, and they wanted to watch something calming and cheering before work and school in the morning. The result being what this clergyman calls the best television of the week. There are also complaints in the press about the types of plays being shown on a Sunday not being suitable to a day of worship that date back at least to 1949. But Sunday was a major day for new plays on the BBC television service at the time, not least because, remember, every performance is live, and it was a day when theatre actors would be available to appear in those live productions. So, whatever the plays were that were being put on by the BBC, at least the main play, would tend to appear on a Sunday. Modern readers may also be less able to immediately place the references in Hunt's letter to Wilfred Pickles and the Grove family, and particularly to understand their specific relevance. Wilfred Pickles was a BBC presenter who retained his northern accent even as a newsreader, before he became something more of a general presenter as host of radio game show Have a Go from 1946 to 1967, and television show Ask Pickles, which ran from 1954 to 1956, both of which were focused on ordinary people as contestants and participants. Pickles was thus seen as part of the BBC with the common touch, who could relate to and engage those ordinary, average British people that Barker mentioned. Pickles, in other words, was not even seemingly highbrow, let alone sadistically so. And the same could be said for early soap opera The Grove Family. As with Pickles, the Grove family presented accents that were not RP, and which could be taken as presenting a lower middle-class existence. Mr. Grove owned his own business. All of this would have been common knowledge in 1954. And in 2021, the basics can be picked up from a quick Wikipedia search. But this is still a piecing together of understanding. And the specifics of what something like lower middle class meant in 1954 are not so easy to interpret from our standpoint. Indeed, it would be easy to simplistically place the Groves as a working class representation, missing the nuances and shifts in class in England. So we are again faced with the requirement of developing specific knowledge and understanding just to understand this one letter and how its presentation of a particular taste construction incorporates issues of class and status. But let's return to the horror comics, having developed a bit more of an understanding of the specific cultural context drawn out from Hunt's letter. In particular, we can return to Barker's point about the phrase horror comics being used to represent anything that the ordinary, average, decent British person would not touch, and think a bit about how important happenstance is to research. While I knew a bit about the 1950s British anti-horror comics campaign from previous general knowledge, but mostly from Barker's work, I happened to watch a French documentary on Tarzan showing on Sky Arts, which mentioned that the Tarzan comics had been caught up in an anti-comics campaign in France in the 1950s. Further research revealed that it was not just Britain and France, but much of Europe had seen campaigns against comics, often specifically against American comics in this period. Overall, these were concerned with challenges to national identity and power, as a seemingly unscathed US brought military, economic, and cultural power to bear on the post-war world. And the old world of Europe had to find its place in the future. So this included the UK, which not only had to deal with post-war recovery, but which was also seeing the end of empire and the loss of the colonies which had provided for and supported the UK during the war. In other words, the fight over comics is a fight over culture and place in the world. And particularly, it is a fight for the future place of each nation in the world, with comics having a primarily young readership and so being seen as a way of transmitting cultural values. So what does all this have to do with 1984? The novel and the play showed an exhausted London. The UK reduced the status of Airstrip 1, which can be interpreted as placing it as nothing more than a staging post in the war against Eurasia. Consider how American military bases during the war had operated under American law, with their own supplies, regulations, and behaviours. For some, representing even in fictional form this depleted, potentially occupied UK could be unpatriotic. A reminder of the loss of power and the potential future diminished position of the UK on the world stage. Even 9 years after the end of the war, in a country making a strong recovery, the reminder of the losses of the war and the handing over of power to others was seen as unacceptable. Indeed, we can see that there are people around today who were not even around during the war who would find this representation unacceptable and say so very publicly. So understanding these different elements of this letter help us to understand the taste position being put forward by the writer. It can be cross-referenced, of course, with other letters, and there were a number of other correspondence to the BBC or articles in newspapers which made the connection with the horror comics. Also, understanding this letter, this usage in relation to 1984 adds to our broader understanding of how mid-1950s Britain engaged with the idea of horror comics. But it also shows us that the concerns with preserving cultural identity that were part of the British horror comics campaign were not unique to Britain, but were part of wider European concerns, focusing on comics in the face of a world where power was shifting from Europe to the US, and where the UK was being presented with the question of aligning themselves either with the rebuilding continental Europe or with the powerful Anglophone US. And the fact that these viewers and campaigners connected these concepts, however unconsciously, to the adaptation of 1984 actually shows us that both Orwell and Neil, the adapter of the television version, were successful in using the narrative to engage with concerns about British identity and power in the post-war era. This would not be the first or last time that people's complaints about a cultural product showed that it was successfully doing its work. My interest in this runs beyond this desire for understanding, although that's certainly where I started from. I'm also interested in how we can use these texts in teaching and understanding the challenges that our students face in dealing with these, the distances between the common knowledge that I've just picked up along the way and that which my students will need to do research in order to find out. And how do we uncover what is common knowledge? So none of that is a new observation, really. But as we think about how quickly the media and culture is changing, I wonder about using these examples in the classroom to help students understand about research techniques as well as about media and culture. So that's my task, turning this into teaching and learning. And I hope that you found some of my reflecting on that and my research processes here interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Derek. That was so interesting. And to sadistically highbrow is definitely going to be my new Twitter bio, I've decided. Amazing. Really, really good. Thank you. So interesting. Okay, we're now going to move to Ipsita, who is going to be doing a paper on women in early Indian television and the feminist movement in the 1970s. So thank you very much, and we look forward to your paper.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the organizers for giving me this opportunity. And so my paper is called Women in Early Television, but instead of giving an overview and having a lot of women professionals that I speak about, I think within the limited time I'm going to talk about one anchor of a television talk show. So I have a subtitle which is the Tabassum Phenomenon, Remediating the Monochrome in 1970s and 2000. So in this presentation, I focus on a television talk show of the 1970s and its host, Tabassum. I also foreground my source in the digital archive. I access the show through a YouTube archive. It's a YouTube channel, called Tabassum Talkies. So I raise new questions about researching media histories, and I juxtapose excerpts of Phool Khile Hain Gulshan Gulshan, which is the talk show, and look at the monochrome aesthetics in the television talk show in the 70s, which was central to the way in which cinema was remediated on television. And then I come back to the current context and look at how this show finds new resurgence in the digital and a new politics of nostalgia that comes out in the digital. So the eponymous Tabassum Talkies is a YouTube channel run by Tabassum, a well-known former actress and television anchor, best known for her signature talk show Phool Khile Hain Gulshan Gulshan, or to loosely translate in English, Flowers Are in Bloom. The talk show was one of the first programs aired on Indian television in 1972 and ran for nearly 2 decades. For the first decade, it was telecast in black and white before television became color and nationwide in 1982. Although during its early phase, television in general was seen as experimental and amateurish, Phool Khile Hain gained immense popularity by remediating film content and discourse on television. In the current media landscape of memory boom and resurrection of television archives on the digital, Phool Khile Hain's monochromatic legacy takes on renewed aura on the YouTube channel Tabassum Talkies. The YouTube channel consists of now close to 100 10-minute videos with a septuagenarian Tabassum relating the history of Bombay cinema through a long career from 1940s till the 1990s. She uses various media artifacts, such as early film clips of hers as child artist, on-shoot and personal photographs with film personalities, footages of Phool Khile Hain, the talk show, in black and white as well as in color, and videotaped stage anchoring to weave a personal history of Indian media. Exhibiting an archaeological impulse, Tabassum Talkies creates a palimpsest of temporalities, aesthetics, and materialities of various media forms of the past decades. Tabassum Talkies foregrounds the apparatus, a contemporary tune at the start, and hyper-real background against the host enhances depth and the authenticity of various analog medias. From the current context, I will draw upon excerpts of Phool Khile Hain, the talk show on television in the 70s, to reflect on an earlier moment of television's history. I analyzed the talk show in terms of how the entry of television affected a broader audiovisual landscape. I traced Fool Killé's precarious beginnings at the intersection of television's novelty and newness, the rise of star system in cinema, new approaches to film reportage in print media, and Tabassum's distinct persona, which intervened in this intermediate landscape. From the current context, the last part of the presentation returns to the current moment of the digital to foreground two distinct layers of remediation and politics of nostalgia at play in the resurgence of Fool Khile on Tabassum Talkies. Now coming back to the 70s audiovisual context, Fool Khile is Indian television's first talk show. Although talk-based programs formed a large chunk of television content in the early stage, such as studio interviews, panel discussions, quiz and current affairs, etc. Fool Khile was the first variety program to incorporate all elements, such as film excerpts, the presence of a charismatic host, and, most distinctively, an informal style, chat-like conversation style with prominent figures. So to contextualize the program in the 70s media landscape, I first look at fan magazines and how the show intervened in the existing film discourse. So before the arrival of television, print media constituted the main site of film journalism. In the 70s, as the film industry strongly gravitated towards the star system, magazines also began to focus on prominent figures and celebrities. Leading fan magazines like Stardust positioned the star in the landscape of scandal, glamour, and gossip. The star became a vehicle to channelize growing middle-class aspiration for better living and high-end consumerism. Magazine stories were accompanied with a copious number of advertisements of consumer and lifestyle goods, beauty products, fashion items, holiday packages, home and entertainment technologies. This was a time when color photography was a novelty. Even color cinema was a relatively new phenomenon. Glossy magazines, a mix of monochrome and color, were therefore a visual treat, and their covers mentioned pages in which favorite stars could be found photographed in color. Fool Khile had to compete with these visual sites of film and star discourse, operating within the strict regime of state-run media's self-censorship. Private lives of stars, gossip and scandal could be depicted only to a certain extent on television. Fool Khile therefore pitted television's live and in-person interview of stars as a new layer of star knowledge vis-a-vis a print culture of distortion and scandal. Star in the ordinary setup of television chat show were not only presented as different from the larger-than-life representations on screen, on the large screen, a predominant aesthetics of close-up and liveness compensated for the lack of color spectacle and highlighted the star's physical being through a rhetoric of natural and authentic self. But what makes Fool Khile particularly significant is how it diversified focus from stars to marginal figures and those working behind the scenes. When public perception of the film industry was largely mediated through celebrity and gossip magazines, Fool Khile redefined film journalism by generating knowledge on industrial practice, film labor, various dimensions of star system, and film legacy. Stars were only one point of identification, wherein cinema was presented as a site of production rather than consumption. This had much to do with the anchor, Tabassum, whose persona became a crucial force in mediating the intermediate landscape between print, cinema, and television. Due to her previous background in cinema, Tabassum brought in various film personalities to the show, enhancing educational television's appeal. At the same time, her curating practices imparted cultural value to commercial cinema, negotiating within existing debates and anxieties about commercial cinema's increasing presence on television. So Tabassum joined the film industry at the infantile age of 3 in order to support her family, which ran an Urdu language literary paper. At the age of 3, Tabassum acted in the legendary director Sohrab Modi's film Majdar, and while the film slumped, Tabassum drew considerable attention and film reviews praised her precocious girliness and Urdu diction. Well known for playing child versions for leading actresses like Nargis, Meena Kumari, Madhubala, and Suraya, Tabassum was commonly called Baby Tabassum or the Indian Shirley Temple. However, her film career soon fizzled when she made a comeback in her teens as an adult actress after completing studies and training in dance. Tabassum was only offered leading roles in B and C grade films. As she reinvented herself on television, she brought her multiple experiences of fame and rejection, hardships and success, as well as her observance of past struggles and challenges faced by artists and stars in the industry to give a certain material and emotional density to Phool Khile Hain. Beyond celebrated figures, she provided a platform to the industry's hidden, discarded characters. In this regard, Phool Khile Hain remained distinct and fundamentally different from the later celebrity talk shows on Indian television like Coffee with Karan and Rendezvous, which were solely based on the lives and revelations of rich and famous. While Tabassum's form of fame as child actress brought considerable currency to her television persona, another major attribution was her proficiency in Urdu. The latter also aligned Tabassum with the cultural values of broadcasting medium, which gave a premium to classical arts, language, and literature. Notably, besides anchoring Phool Khile Hain, Tabassum often featured in Shairi Mushairas or Urdu poetry symposiums on television. In one such shows, Tabassum presents a striking image as the lone woman artist amidst a sea of illustrious male poets. As she presents a 4-minute patriotic couplet on national integration, Tabassum appears spellbound by the gathering as she sways and recites away in a cadenced trance. She brings a similar passion when discussing cinema on the talk show, which she perceives not as mere entertainment but a multi-layered and collaborative art form. Based on her distinguished background in Urdu, Tabassum presents herself as art connoisseur with a keener sense in assessing and presenting to the viewers the finer skill sets of the host of artists and entrepreneurs who come together at the Bombay film industry. In these ways, Tabassum's persona formed a bridge between television's cultural ethos and commercial cinema, hitherto considered to exist on the margins of public taste, institution, and morality. So to look at certain episodes and how the talk show mounted an alternative discourse on cinema, a case in point is the interview with Rameshwari, an emerging actress of the 70s. The said episode opens with a title song from recently released eponymous film Sunaina, meaning Pretty Eyes, based on its female protagonist, a female character played by Rameshwari. The song is followed by the studio camera zooming into Rameshwari's eyes as Tabassum comments about them being the actress's most beautiful asset. The scene is evidently a promotional gimmick for the film shown at the start. However, its connotation shifts as Tabassum soon reveals that Rameshwari damaged her eyes in a recent shoot. As Rameshwari narrates the account, besides when and how of the incident, it is revealed that despite a major accident, Rameshwari had to finish the ongoing shoot. Anxious about any further mishaps, her subsequent film producer also funded an expensive eye treatment abroad. In this episode, the talk show is explicitly showcased as a platform for personal accounts and the foremost medium of truth and intimacy compared to other sources of film information. This host is also seen to play a crucial role in mediating between viewers and the film personality. For although Tabassum stages a voyeuristic opening for film publicity, she soon switches agency to the actress, whose subjective accounts bring into view issues of film labor and commodification. In another episode, the theme of film labor is explored by providing a platform to the most marginal of the industry, Bombay industry, the female stunt double. In this remarkable interview, a stunt actress Reshma talks about her life-threatening action sequences in 70s mega blockbuster film Sholay, and in another popular film Curse. So in the former film, um, she does a 3-minute chase sequence in which the female protagonist speeds a horse-driven chariot, and in the second one, she is hit by a truck, and in reality, she actually hurts her spine. So, unlike in the case of Rameshwari, Reshma was not provided treatment, nor was there any insurance system in the 70s. The interview brings out such aspects, the lack of trade union and the meager and irregularity of income in the profession of stunt actors. When asked about how she balances an unconventional and hazardous career with other life goals like marriage, Reshma Pathan professes to value her freedom and professional life over conjugality. Her fierce independence, embracing personal choices lying outside of social norms, presents a rare image on national television in the 70s. It is both at variance with predominant feminine identities seen in lifestyle and film magazines, in which the glamorous film actresses are portrayed as ultimately wishing to marry and settle down, and also the educational women's programs on television directed towards family planning, domesticity, and child raising. The interview also reveals how, behind commercial cinema's extravagance, exists networks of labor and subjectivities with various transactional relationships to on-screen lives. The previous section demonstrate these two examples demonstrate how Tabassum pushed the boundaries of both cinema and television by challenging the current star system and television's sanitized environment. Finally, I come to the last section of the presentation, where I look at how Phool Khile Hain was directed at legitimizing television itself and its monochromatic visuality as it competed within a larger audiovisual landscape of color. During television's infancy in the 70s, screenings of old films was common, and the telecast of Hindi film was the most popular program, leaving streets of Bombay empty on Sunday evenings. Based on the tremendous appeal of such reruns, Phool Khile Hain generated additional conversation and nostalgia for cinema of a recent past. Film excerpts from old blockbusters and interviews with earlier stars was a key attraction of the show. While on the one hand prominent artists from previous generations filled the dearth of contemporary stars, many were also current in the sense that their films were being shown on television. For instance, Naushad, Kamal Amrohi, Durga Khote, and many others who came to the show were familiar personalities who acquired renewed stardom through television rerun of their films. In interviews in the talk show, past-present trope was used to reconstruct a nostalgic landscape of Bombay cinema through shifting film practices. Surendra Nath, actor from silent era cinema, for instance, discusses technical aspects of filming songs in the pre-playback singing era. Durga Khote likewise talks about the peculiar features of the silent period, such as the factor that actors were chosen for their singing and miming abilities since songs were shot in single takes. Following a clip from Mughal-e-Azam, an iconic film, Khote then talks about the stress on perfecting Urdu diction and laborious training sessions at Prabhat's studio and how she was made to practice posture and body movements. The fact that most guests were asked to talk about their professional practice not only occasioned discussion of iconic film scenes in black and white, but also foregrounded film labor which gets obscured in discourses of talent and star charisma. Discussions with veteran artists also conjured a distinct historical and geographical landscape of older studios, various training schools, cultural movements, and dying traditions, instead of the nightclubs and luxury restaurants of star magazines. The urban landscape evoked here was one of loss. To evoke the passage of time, oftentimes guests were also asked to share anecdotal narratives recalling aged and even deceased contemporary co-stars. So in conclusion, I would like to use this case study to reflect on factors that triggered remediation in and of film Phool Khile Hain, that is of cinema on television in the 70s and now of analog media in 2000s. So Phool Khile Hain played a crucial role in remediating cinema as an object of entertainment, information, and nostalgia in the 70s to negotiate a complex matrix of legitimacy between cinema and television. Remediation cinema in 70s performed memory practices by starting a process of classicization of monochrome cinema. The behind-the-scene testimonies in ordinary studio acquired credence against the glitz and glamour of star magazines. In 2000s, these traces of television's early entertainment history acquire new archival depth, and monochrome performs stylistic and affective play of pastness. With the saturation of color in contemporary visual media, the recirculation of Phool Khile Hain on Tabassum talkies performs a very different role compared to its original context, as it connotes film and television memory at a time of flux and transience. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. So I will stop the share now.
Thank you so much. Oh, yes, you're getting lots of claps. That was absolutely fascinating. And yet, if we could just, before we move on to the discussion, if we can just use our clap emojis to thank all three speakers this morning. It's been absolutely fascinating. Now, okay. I can't. I'm going to use a heart instead in the message. Okay, thank you so much for that. Now we've got just over half an hour. If you could just unshare your screen for me, that would be brilliant. So we can see people's faces. So we've got just over half an hour. Oh, disappeared, but your screen is still.
Just a second.
No worries. While Ipsita sorts that out, I don't know if anyone wants to pop any questions in the messages, or whether anyone's got a question they'd like to ask. It's always nice to ask in person. So just remember to unmute, so you're not mouthing needlessly at the camera, as we've been doing so much in the last 18 months. Okay. Oh, I can see wonderful faces now. Barbel, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Have you got a question that you'd like to ask? No. Okay, you're just typing something. Okay. So have we got any observations or questions for any of us? Oh, Elka. What would you like to ask?
Thank you all for amazing papers. I've really, really enjoyed them, as you will unfortunately also see on Twitter. I've got a question for all three of you, really, which is kind of continuing from what Ipsita said about legitimation, and you know how how the talk show, in a way, engaged with cinema on the one hand, but also with kind of what television was supposed to do. And one of the things that really struck me about, the audience responses, including that one letter, which, by the way, thank you so much for that detailed reading. That was so fascinating. But what really struck me about the audience responses as well is how they all included an element of expectation, and to some extent, that is also visible in how the program itself, the talk show itself, imagined how to talk about cinema on Indian television. So what can we learn, or what do you think can we learn also by looking at the history of television about the expectations and that common knowledge, as Derek called it, about what television is supposed to do at a particular point in time?
Anyone else want to start? I think it's a great question. It's something that really interests me, is that question of what is television for? And it's something that, of course, has lots of different answers depending upon the different positions that you're taking. And I think you're right there about how that letter I was looking at, one of the things it was saying was there's a difference between what television's for on a Sunday as opposed to any other day of the week. So I think that there's an enormous amount of material ideas that we can take from this reception. And I really think that Ipsita's paper was intriguing about that negotiation, you should say, between film and TV. And just an aside, it had me thinking about seeing talk shows when I was younger where they would have old Hollywood stars, Terry Wogan or Michael Parkinson talking to Buster Keaton. And that way of communicating a history of other media, but as Ipsita was saying, sorry, preempting you here, approaching it from a different angle. So maybe you want to pick up and stop me rambling.
Yeah, no. Thank you, Elka. Thank you, Derek, for, it's a great question and something I have been thinking about a lot. So going to the question of what are our assumptions about television and what do we then discover when we go to these archives, and the archives are also changing with the digital and the nature of the archive, and what it throws up in terms of how we do our research. And as I talked about in this particular archive, there's a sort of intermediate landscape that opens up automatically, and so when I watch current television and even not linear television, but even Netflix, and how nostalgia is so central to the current media landscape. And whether you're talking about some of the most prominent streaming platform shows like Glow and Stranger Things and so many of these others, and they're all about nostalgia and different forms of nostalgia. And then I go back to my research on early television. I feel that it's kind of there also. So while we are talking about television in terms of liveness and sort of ephemera and all of that, but there is also the memory practices, nostalgia is also there in early television. And I think in my project, I sort of go back to this point of origin where there is this form of nostalgia is not so common at that time. There is color, there's monochrome. Color is actually more, the spectacular and hierarchically very, the more preferred and sophisticated form at that time, because color photography had just come in, color cinema had just started in the 60s, and monochrome was supposed to be kind of the older media and the amateurish media. And then it had to legitimize itself. So form of classicization of older cinema and nostalgia develops at this point. And I'm contrasting that and how that happens with the current landscape and, you know, this kind of memory boom that we have when television is, you know, at a point of, you know, physical in, you know, transience. So so I think this in my presentation, I wanted to not just look at, you know, the talk show in the past, but also foreground how I am kind of, you know, my access to it through the digital now. And, you know, I have also access to the physical, the official archive. And interestingly, none of the entertainment programs are there in the official archive, you know, because they were not considered to be good enough and quality television in those days. And the host of this show, she was actually she's a very interesting figure, and the way she's curated her, you know, current YouTube show, it's just so interesting because she almost kind of, you know, knows and preempts and anticipates, you know, and then, you know, she's the only one who has kind of, you know, taken records of her production when video came in and recording came in. So she went back to those programs and she preserved them. And now she has this YouTube channel where they are sort of recirculating. And, you know, I have access to that kind of content and that kind of history of television in India, which is not there in the official archives. So, yeah, so I hope that answers.
Sita, I thought it was really interesting the way the host of the TV show you highlighted. She very carefully gave a voice, I think, to people who otherwise stories are not told. The stories of quite marginalised workers, people who perhaps weren't unionised, and also those who, you know, stunt workers who traditionally have obviously been treated quite badly. But I thought the way she did it was so artful, because she was presenting it in this very classic way. But actually, she was offering these layers, so some people could just watch it as interesting anecdotes, whereas other people could hear that further story. I really loved that. I thought that she was fascinating and so brilliant to do that. It would have been so easy to fall into the usual trope of being the chat show presenter. There was so much in there, so thank you. Derek, I thought both your and Charlotte's really talked about how we feel ownership and community with programs as well. So with Charlotte's, the idea that some of these programs will lead you to these events, these happenings, people are having food and there's a kind of a warmth to it. But with yours, the fact that someone was so upset by what was being presented, they took pen to paper. But they were also trying to kind of point out, you're not making TV for me, you're making TV for what you think is the audience. And I think there's still that conversation goes on every day. You only have to go onto Twitter and those conversations. That letter could have been written in a slightly different form today. And isn't that interesting that we become kind of almost enraged? And there's always the thing of, someone who used to work for the BBC, license pays money. You're giving us what you think we want, not what we want. I thought it was really, really brilliant. So that really, I just wanted to kind of say how much I got out of all three on different levels. So thank you. Got a few lovely comments in the message. Barbara says really inspiring talks. Claire says great papers. Tom says great talks, everyone. Thank you. Carl says thank you all. Really enjoyed the presentations. Have we got any other talking points, or does anyone want to carry on with the brilliant question that Elka just posed?
Yeah, I'll chime in on that. Just like the who's TV for, what's television supposed to do, and the angle that I keep coming to with the 1980s cop show fandoms is I don't get the sense that the producers of these shows were thinking about middle-class American women opening up a case of champagne over a weekend, getting completely drunk, and counting how many times the guys are barefoot. Like, it seems like this goes beyond tactical rereadings. This is shout out to Hazel Colley's work around the pleasures that human viewers get out of TV that isn't them. So really not much more to say on that, but just who is Starsky for? Is it for the audience that the film version thought it was for, or is the TV show actually for a much broader and diverse range of folks that had engaged with it? And that's something that I find really exciting and fascinating. So we have this narrative around mid-century television fandoms is like, well, women like Star Trek, and that's an important feminist point. But also, we have this evidence of other meanings being made and other enjoyments.
Absolutely. Kenneth, you've got your hand up as well.
Hi, I'm responding. Thanks, Charlotte. That was great. I was just responding to Elka's question: what's television for? Who's it for? Especially at the moment with the Olympics on TV. Christine last week made me laugh because in one of the chats on one of the sessions last week, she said, "I'm off to go and watch the Olympics now," and that's something that in the past has always been sold as community building. We're all watching it together, but that experience has changed certainly since I was a child, because we have more channels now. At one time you couldn't escape the Olympics, so everybody watched it. But is that the same now? I mean, is it there to make community?
I've got some thoughts.
Yeah. What do you think about that, Derek? Kenneth, could you just take your hand down, please, love?
Yeah, well,
I know exactly what you mean, Kenneth, about you never used to be able to escape the Olympics. So you watched it because it was on, particularly in the summer holidays, along with silent movies or Old Republic or serials on BBC Two. And this was how you got community building, but also, as we talked about, that history of the media being fed back by public service broadcasting. One of the things I've noticed, you may have seen it as well on Twitter and other places, people complaining because the BBC isn't showing absolutely every Olympic event, and it having to be explained to them that's not BBC's fault. So there's the way that this thing that has been theorized as a unifying media event is actually being used as a disrupting, deunifying, let's knock down the BBC kind of tool.
Wow. And it's interesting why the BBC aren't showing everything, because they sold some of their rights, didn't they?
No, they couldn't afford the rights.
Sorry, I got them to the wrong end of the stick there.
That's fine. It's presented in complicated ways, but yeah, it moved off. And as Elka's saying, thanks, Elka. Who's causing that disruption, that perception of disruption? Like I was saying, a lot of the complaints about 1984 came along after the press had said, this is a horrible thing you should complain about. And you get that feedback loop that we're all familiar with in news reporting about someone comes up with something to be annoyed about. So, yeah, it's a big issue at the moment about public service broadcasting, how it relates to its different audiences. And this must be a debate, I'm sure, in India as well, which is seeing that proliferation of media outlets. And what happens? What do we do about media diversity and its place in society? So, lessons from history.
Yeah. Also, Derek, I mean, the idea or the experience of public service broadcasting is different, isn't it? In different countries. I mean, in America, it was virtually non-existent, and yet, but in this country, it was very, very strong. This idea generated by the BBC, etc. So yeah, I mean, this idea of public service broadcasting has strange dynamics, doesn't it? Depending on where you are.
At the same time, Charlotte's research shows. Sorry, Christine
Unmute
speaking.
your mic.
Unmuted. was just going to say that Charlotte's research shows that there's an international element to this as well, and that it's not necessarily about national public service audiences. And the fact that I could go onto YouTube now and see this Indian TV program reconstructed and use that to learn about that history, that's not dependent on public service. So we've got these shifts in audiences and how we serve them.
I'll just pick
I
up.
can see that Elka's a really interesting point actually in the comments, which might be worth repeating actually, Elka.
Yeah, so just I'm really struck, and I wonder. I mean, this is probably also true for Ipsita and for Charlotte. You know how important actually you know the letter scenes were also in, for example, in creating that buzz around particular programs, and you know how important actually the talk show was in creating the buzz about old cinema as well. So how nostalgia was really fed through that thing. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Okay.
Bob,
Christine,
I've not researched historical TV to get in The Guardian.
Nor would I think any of us would, but that was literally what my line manager said to me when he found out that I was in television scholarship. So clearly we're all just in it for, you know, all that foot traffic on our articles in The Guardian. Mm.
Christine, sorry, did you make a point? I think you were muted. You are still muted, lovely.
It's all right. I was just wondering whether Ipsita had anything to say about the Olympic coverage in India, as Derek indicated that she might. And also if Charlotte might comment perhaps on a little more on binge, whether you would call this binge watching, the VCR viewing, because we previously had binge watching so much associated with streaming.
Oh, wonderful questions. Start with you, Ipsita.
Well, Christine, thank you. But I mean, I'm not really following. I'm currently in Singapore, and
okay.
yeah, but generally to talk about, you know, a sense of, you know, public broadcasting and a sort of mass audience. I mean, something interesting that I have found out about early Indian television is that for 20 years, it was not actually national at all. It was only in 6 cities, and the programming was very specific to those cities. Although there were like women program and children program and, you know, your news and current affairs and all of that, the model was the same, but the way in which educational television was actually implemented in each of these cities and what it meant. And you know, while we have notions of educational television, you know, it was also, if you look at the production histories, it was also how these television anchors and how these television producers are playing a very major role in terms of what it really meant and how they wanted to, you know, interpret it. And so, for instance, in Bombay, while entertainment and cinema was, you know, in the 70s, and this was also, you know, Indian television was never commercial. It was also sort of, it was not socialist, but we had like a mixed economy, but it had like a socialist kind of ethos in the 70s. And so Bombay television, if you see, was mainly guided by entertainment, and news and emergency was not so central to it at all. But when you look at Delhi television, it was current affairs, and we also had like a 2-year period of dictatorship and emergency in the 70s. And, you know, television was very central to, you know, establishment of emergency and a sort of media landscape that it wanted to portray. But when you go to Bombay, they don't have that kind of, you know, media memory of the emergency at all. So, you know, and so the relationship between entertainment and educational television is also different in all these cities. So I think we can also think about television histories in terms of not national but also local television. I think that's definitely something that is coming up in my research, because in 20 years you have so much viewership, you have so much, you know, interaction with this medium, and which is not national at all. So yeah, that's also something one can think of.
Great. And Charlotte, if we could move to the second part of Christine's question.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I think the question about whether or how is this binge watching or is it not, is going to come down to how you define binge watching. And there are folks probably more qualified in the call to give an exhaustive overview of what exactly binging is. But if we take a kind of loose definition of watching a couple episodes of something outside of a broadcast schedule, then we can definitely apply that definition back past the box set, past the DVD box set, into the affordances of the videotape. I kind of prefer marathon, which is a word that will come up more commonly in 1980s fieldwork around fandoms. Lisa Perks also is the media marathon, calls it that. Spent on television times. And another reason I kind of like marathoning was you have to train up for it. It's got that kind of more. You have to do to work up to the point, right? It's a training exercise. It's an endurance test, but also it has a lovely echo to like a drive-in cinema movie marathon, or thinking about television schedules, having marathons that are programmed for you. And I kind of like that more than those conversations of a binge that we're aware of. And coming back to the definition of like watching a couple episodes of something for broadcast schedule, you get that in the conventions where I'll sit down and play tapes all night. You get that in the letters of, you know, having a party and doing it, and also folks talking about working through an entire season on their own in a couple of weeks, or a couple of days, just to get through all of the content. So the practice sounds like what we would call binge streaming, and also the international tape sharing, like folks copying and changing formats of stars keeping touch, going in a direction, and professional going in the other direction, in the 80s particularly. You have a thing where you would receive a videotape that has 8 episodes in it, which is kind of like dropping an entire season all at once. So you do have sudden capacity to sit down and watch 50 stuff. So yeah, it depends on where you draw that line. But we're thinking through.
But we definitely didn't invent binge watching. Netflix didn't invent binge watching. I think that's something we can all agree on. And I like the idea that it's a marathon. I wonder how we pre-game for it. So, you know, you might watch a little mini series and then get all the Starsky and Hutch VHSs out, and and the food. The food's important. I so want to know what the menu was. They keep talking about delicious food in those archival cards you showed, and I was like, but what were they eating? I'm thinking very sophisticated, but sophisticated for that time, like mushroom canapes and that kind of food,
What as well with cop shows and bubbly.
Yeah, and I really like their style. I want to be their friends. Okay, so it's the same. I'm so here for that party. Okay, so we're just down to the last 10 minutes now. So I wondered if anyone else had any observations about the talk, or there's any other comments that you'd like to make. Please do. Derek.
I didn't know to raise my hand or not. I've got a question actually for both Charlotte and Zita, and both of your papers seem to me to be saying something or have potential to say something about gender in the time that you were looking at, and I think with Ipsita's particularly looking at the changing gender roles, is fascinating. I wondered if there were any points you'd like to pick up on that theme. Thank
you. So yeah, Derek, so gender is actually quite central to the history of early television in India, it seems, because at this time, television was kind of on the margins. It was like experimental medium, and it was public. Very interesting, shifts were happening. So a lot of people were coming from radio to handle this new medium, and they were obviously not equipped in terms of, a visual sensibility. And, a whole other chunk of people came on contract from other, platforms like theater and so largely theater and, cultural music and dance, and because there was a lot of classical art forms that programs needed to be done, and most of these people were women because the contract jobs were low paying. And this was also a time when in the 70s the feminist movement had just started. I mean, it was already there in the UK and the US, and it was kind of taking shape in India, and women were joining the workforce, and television actually provided a great medium and a very unique medium for creative expression. So most of the jobs which were available were for social work or secretarial jobs, and this was the only medium that provided sort of creative potentials. And interestingly, a lot of the entertainment programming in Delhi were actually done by women. So they did all the teledramas and the telefilms, and apparently they were, these programs were considered to be sort of, not good enough for the men, who were encouraged. And I have, a lot of these I'm talking to producers also, and I have some of these, writings in, some of the archival material and interviews where, men were encouraged to go into news and current affairs, which were also higher paying. And then, by default, women were doing the teledramas and all the entertainment programs. And they were also, because news and current affairs was really under the radar, these programs, they could really do a lot with it. Of course, there was self-censorship, but at the same time, they were constantly pushing the medium, constantly sort of pushing its limits. And that's another story where they're doing a whole lot of interesting things in terms of gender identities, in terms of even, the position of television, and in terms of, censorship. So they're constantly trying to, push the limits of censorship itself. And they had, it's also interesting how there's this very interesting intermediate landscape, because, it's a new medium and you're trying to understand the aesthetics and all of it. And this was also a time in India where, you don't have that kind of funding, you don't have the kind of latest technology. So, a lot of the drama and the theater were being, sort of remediated on television. And drama in the 70s was going through its own churning, and sort of, a lot of political content was being produced. So if you look at the fictional content, which was by and large produced by the women, there was a lot of interesting things happening. And so as some of the producers, they say that television grew with us, and we grew with television. So I think that's a very interesting way of sort of showing how important and central it was to, gender relations at this point. Yeah.
Thank you, Charlotte.
I just quickly to wrap up, a lot of what I've read in the magazines seems to confirm what we already know, just from a different direction, about who is in media fandom tends to be men, though I don't know if they all identify as women these days. I'm thinking about different conversations around identification in contemporary moments, and also what we know about the centrality of television in the home. So it makes sense that you invite people around, have a party, put on some food, do other kinds of domestic labor, and finish labor. It's also something we familiar with critically. The one nuance that the work does show is that you are incredibly comfortable with evolving media technologies. Like there's no, can't recall a single instance of, well, my husband had to program the VCR for me so that I could dub the TV. Well, I've rented one, I've rented a second one, I can change formats. Here's how I do, here's the technical breakdown. Here is, a diagram of how I do things like the early bidding is talking about in some of these. Like, what's your favorite VCR? Here's a list of the 6 models that seem to be the best for the kind of things we can do. And kind of like, it's not like these women are into dude things like cop shows and it's just that these things are more just a traditionally constructed now user base.
Oh, thank you, Michelle. I think that brings us to the end of this fascinating morning of papers. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think any Monday morning, which my notes ended up saying with the word exquisite torch and sadistically highbrow in, that's a good Monday morning in my book. Thank you so very much to our speakers. So a round of applause. Really, really brilliant work. Obviously, this has been recorded, so if you know anyone you think would get something out of this, please do point them to those YouTube links, which is very diligently sharing. And obviously, the fund doesn't stop. We've got another talk this afternoon. If you can spare the time to go and support other people doing their own work, that would be brilliant. And Elka, perhaps, I'm not sure if she's able to maybe tell us about what time that's on. I have got the programme in front of me.
Yes, the next session is at 4 o'clock today. Link has been sent out to everyone.
Lovely. That only leaves me to say thank you to everyone. A big clap. Thank you for offering me a brilliant Monday morning. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, everybody. And we're now going to end this session.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.